Hi guys, this is going to be a rare monthly wrap-up video from me because I read a lot of very good, very interesting books in the month of May, fiction and non-fiction, but this is only going to be a fiction wrap-up. I'm going to film a separate wrap-up of my recent non-fiction sometime soon, maybe at the end of the month. And just a heads up, I'm going to film this wrap-up in two different parts because filming it in one go just seems like such a huge chore for me at the moment, and I'm most likely going to film the second part on a different day, so my outfit will change in the course of the video. So the big event of May was the publication of Natasha Pulley's new novel, The Kingdoms. This is historical fiction containing time travel, so historical fiction slash spec fic, I'd say. It begins with the protagonists coming out of some sort of mysterious episode, and he comes to at a London station in 1898 without any recollection of the past and of who he is, but like is typical for amnesia, I guess, he has an intuitive knowledge of how the world works and a kind of almost a muscle memory about how to exist in it. And yet at the same time, as he is getting his bearings and trying to piece his life together, he has this gut feeling that something is very wrong with the world. So, for instance, he knows that there is nothing weird about the fact that everybody around him is speaking French, even though we are in London, and that all the signs and all the street signs are written in French, because after all, the English lost at the Battle of Trafalgar and were subsequently invaded and then colonized by the French almost a century before. And yet he has this bone-deep instinct inside him that is telling him that things should be different, and that they were in fact different for him in another life. But there is nothing he can do about it, and after a little while his family finds him and he slowly gets back into his old life, even though the feeling never leaves him and his memory never comes back. What stays with him, though, are these shadowy images of some kind of other life that he has led, and in particular, there is a recurring vision of a mysterious stranger who is waiting for him somewhere on a beach. And in the end, these visions lead the protagonist to a lighthouse in the Outer Hebrides, where it turns out there is a portal through time, and he gets kidnapped by a captain of the Royal Navy, the English Royal Navy, and gets taken to the year 1807, where the Royal Navy and the surviving scraps of the English army prepare to drive the French out of England again. The French have invaded and have captured London, and the surviving English army is gathering in Edinburgh, and they are hoping that a person from the future can help them with knowledge of the future, but also knowledge about the technology from the future. And it also turns out that the captain who kidnapped the protagonist knows him from an earlier life and knows who he is and what kind of life he led, but he is reluctant to give him information about that. So this is, for the most part, an Age of Sail war novel. And I don't know if you knew that about me, but I'm a big fan of Age of Sail novels. Of course, there's Temeraire, and while I did not like the Horatio Hornblower books that I've read, I am a big fan of the BBC series. And of course, there is Patrick O'Brian's Aubrey Maturin series. And this book, of course, has nothing on that series. It doesn't come close to the historical detail of Patrick O'Brian's books. It is, however, from what I can tell, quite solid. It is quite a solid look into what life on a ship was like at the time and what a naval battle was like. So I quite enjoyed that aspect of the book. However, what is unfortunately lacking from this book is the one aspect that I think is the strongest aspect of all of Natasha Pulley's other books, and the one thing that I valued and enjoyed the most in them, and that is the peculiar voice of the main character. This main character's voice is unfortunately rather bland, and to a degree that makes sense because, after all, the main character is lost in time and has lost himself, the memory of himself, and with that, he has lost most of his personality. So it's plausible that his voice is lacking in personality. It's just unfortunate for me as a reader. And another thing that disappointed me was that I thought that the emotional crisis point came awfully late in the story. In fact, it hardly came at all. I felt like I was cheated out of it. And this is getting into spoiler territory, squarely into spoiler territory. So I'm putting a warning sign up here. So when it disappears, you know that you can unmute again. So for those who have read the book, I would have expected that at some point Joe would either remember the past or preferably he would fall in love with Kite anew in 1807. And that didn't really happen, did it? In the end, he was willing to tolerate Kite and to not sell him to his enemy in the Admiralty. But he didn't really develop deeper feelings for him. And I would have expected that to happen or for his memory to come back at some point. And I thought that the ending, such as it was very anticlimactic in the emotional department. And I also didn't quite buy the drive that he felt to get back to his daughter. I thought that the one scene that we got of him together with his daughter was not enough to establish that there was such a deep connection and such deep love between the two. Love that was deeper than what he felt for the people in his other life. I mean, you could, of course, argue that it's his daughter, of course, that's what he feels for her, but in the same scene, it is established that a parent doesn't necessarily have such a deep emotional connection with their child, because after all, Joe's wife doesn't feel this connection. And then in this one scene that we get of the two of them together, Joe abandons her because of this vision of Kite on the beach. So this seems to point in the opposite direction, and it seems to say that this other life was more important to him than his daughter. So all in all, for me, it didn't really feel believable, this drive that Joe feels to get back. That said, I still enjoyed reading it for the tall ships and the timey-wimey confusion and the displacement in time content, which always gets me emotionally. And then I found a new gay crime series, yay, new for me, that is. And it's the LA After Midnight Quartet by Steve Neil Johnson. So far, it consists of the books The Yellow Canary, The Black Cat, and The Blue Parrot. And if you look at the publication dates of these books, which are 2012, 2014, and 2016, respectively, if you look at those dates, you might think that the author has probably abandoned the project, but that is not the case. I listened to a podcast episode with him, which aired in February, I think, and in there he said that he is actually getting the last book ready for publication. The main character of the series is, at the beginning of the series, an assistant district attorney in LA. And the series chronicles a number of cases that he investigates together with an LAPD officer and later detective. A number of cases that are very personal to both of them. And by chronicling the series of cases, the books chronicle gay life in the course of 4 decades. The first book is set in the 50s, the second in the 60s, and the third book is set in 1975. And through the murder cases, the books explore a number of social, societal, legal, political issues. In the center, of course, are always gay rights and gay liberation, but a number of issues come with that, like, for instance, police brutality and the corruption of the justice system, and racial tensions, and then in the 60s, of course, the civil rights movement. And I'll tell you outright that these are not the most elegantly written books. However, I thought that the topic and the lives that are portrayed in these books are so interesting that I was able and willing to overlook that. I thought this was a fascinating close look at what gay life and being gay was like in California and LA in those decades. And especially the book about the 1950s was very educational for me, because I know next to nothing about life in California in that decade, apart from what I saw in LA Confidential, which, by the way, gets referenced in the book, not the movie or the book, the novel by James Ellroy, but the Bloody Christmas incident, which is in the center of LA Confidential. And I think the 1950s and 1960s are quite an atypical setting for a gay mystery, so I'm glad I stumbled across these novels and would recommend them if you are interested in getting a glimpse into those decades as well. And welcome to part 2, which is going to be all about the Japanese books that I read. Yes, still going strong. I've already talked at length about One Man's Justice by Akira Yoshimura, because this was my booktube spin book and I vlogged the whole reading experience. This is the story of a Japanese Air Force officer who was complicit in the execution of captured American pilots after Japan's official surrender. And now, a couple months later, after he's been decommissioned, he suddenly finds himself branded as a war criminal because of these actions. Unexpectedly for him, because in his eyes he's done nothing wrong. He only did what everybody else was doing, and he acted according to orders anyway. Um, but he gets warning of this, that this is how he is now perceived, and goes into hiding, at first from the Americans and then also from his own countrymen. So this is a story about why people commit war crimes, about one reason, one specific scenario. And it's a story about how an ordinary person can be turned into a murderer by war, and about what personal tragedies the shifting fortunes of war can create. This is very modest style-wise, but deeply affecting, which seems to be very on brand for Yoshimura. His other novel that I've read, Shipwrecks, is very much the same. And after this, I read another war novel, or anti-war novel, Fires on the Plain by Shohei Ooka. And this was crazy. This is the story of a foot soldier in the Philippines who got injured during the landing of his unit on the Philippine island of Leyte. And he also brought tuberculosis over from Japan, so he is completely unfit for service, can't fight anymore, and is therefore useless to his unit. And because there is a food shortage and a shortage of medical supplies, the army is loath to feed people who are of no use to them any longer. And so he is simply cast out from his unit and more or less directly told to just go die and be of use to the war effort in this way, by removing himself or by relieving the army of the responsibility to feed him. And this is the story of the suffering that he witnesses around him, that of other cast outs. And it chronicles how he comes to feel less and less human for lack of human contact and lack of a community of some sort. But how when he finally rejoins his community, because the Japanese army has disintegrated, has finally admitted defeat, and everyone is trying to evacuate from the island. And when he is therefore able to rejoin what community remains, he discovers that by that point there is even less humanity to be found in that community than outside of it in the end. This book is highly autobiographical. Shohei Ooka served on the Philippines and was captured by the Americans there. And it shows that the book is autobiographical because the author was apparently Christian, and there is a lot of Christian thoughts and symbolism in the book, and the protagonist reads the whole countryside around him in kind of a Lectio Christiana. Everything is full of Christian symbolism for him, which sends him into spirals of thoughts about the apocalypse and how if and how his soul will be saved and stuff like that. It's maybe a bit in your face, but the book is short enough that it doesn't become jarring, even if you are not particularly interested in this kind of exploration. All in all, it's just an extremely fascinating look into a rather obscure episode of World War II, at least obscure for me on the outside. Next, I have two very short novels by Yasushi Inoue, which I don't think have been translated into English. They are definitely available in French, Italian, and obviously German, though. The first one is translated into German under the title The Death of the Teemaster, but its original title is more like The Chronicles or the Journals of Honkaku, because it is styled as the journals of a monk called Honkaku, who is writing in the first quarter of the 17th century. And in these journals, he reflects on the events leading up to the death of his former teacher, who was a historical person. He was the teamaster of the Taiko Hideyoshi in the late 16th century, and was in the end ordered by Hideyoshi to kill himself for reasons that were mysterious to the contemporaries. The blurbs make this book sound like a detective story and a murder mystery, but it's really not. It's really just a very quiet reflection on the lost art and lost lifestyle of a bygone era, bygone already for this monk who is writing in the 17th century. And this is just a lovely little thing. I'm so glad that I discovered Yasushi Inoue and that this was the first book of his that I read. The second book I liked maybe a bit less, but it's also very good, I think. It's called The Black Flood, which is also a faithful translation of the Japanese title. This takes its cue from a famous case in modern Japanese history and from the newspaper coverage of that case. In the summer of 1949, the CEO of the just privatized Japanese National Railway disappeared one day on his way to work, and his remains were found the next morning on some train tracks. The post-mortem suggested that he was already dead when he was hit by the train, but the case was never fully solved, and it remained a mystery whether it was suicide or murder. And the newspaper coverage of the case was, for the most part, sensationalist, with the different newspapers basically having a contest about who could jump to conclusions faster, with one exception, the Mainichi Shimbun, which is still a big paper in Japan, and whose coverage was comparatively neutral and level-headed. And while the journalist who is the protagonist of this book is completely fictitious and his newspaper has a different name, it is clearly inspired by that newspaper and its coverage. And so the journalist protagonist is responsible for the coverage of this case at his newspaper, and he advocates for a cautious attitude because he has an aversion against sensationalist headlines and speculations in suspected suicide cases, because the case hits very close to home for him, because his own wife committed suicide for mysterious reasons just a few years before. And this suicide and its fallout have always been impossible for him to put into words. And so he is very much conscious of the impossibility of putting adequate words to a suicide case and the impossibility of talking about it in a meaningful way. I may have enjoyed the Teemeister book a little bit more, but this was also very good. And then I read The Silent Cry by Kenzaburo, here in the German translation, but of course it has been translated into English as well, and into a host of other languages too. The protagonist and narrator of this book and his wife have nothing left to live for in their life in Tokyo, so they follow his rascal brother back to their old family home in the countryside. The family are landowners, or used to be, and there at the old house they delve into the family history and into an ugly episode that happened a century earlier, when there was a peasant uprising against the landowners. And in addition to that, they discover a more recent ugly episode in the family as well, in addition to discovering more about the darkness within themselves. So this is about depravity and misery and the human stain, I guess, and how people cause each other pain intentionally and unintentionally. But I had my problems with it because it was just too much. It's not exactly misery porn, because there is nothing romanticizing about the way events and the protagonist's thoughts are described. Nothing romanticizing at all. It's all very ugly and very stark. But it is just too much. The novel is just overflowing with it, and every single thing that the narrator sees and thinks is ugly, rotten, and or depraved. And in a long book like that, it just gets too much, and at best it becomes annoying and makes you roll your eyes, and at worst it makes you laugh because it is just so ridiculously exaggerated. And I think that that is the opposite effect of what was intended. I just think if the author had just dialed it down a little bit, it would have had a much bigger impact and would have felt much more honest and realistic to me. So that was quite a disappointment. I have read Oe before. I read his first novel that was published when he was just 23, Nip the Buds, Shoot the Kids in English. And I thought that showed a lot of promise, if that doesn't sound too patronizing. And I already have another shorter novel of his that I'm certainly still going to read, but it might be a while before I pick it up. But to end on a more positive note, last weekend I read Kokoro by the famous modern Japanese novelist Natsume Soseki, and he seems to be a bit of an outlier in that we in the West we usually render Japanese names according to our own conventions by giving the given name first and the family name last. But in this case, somehow he became known. Natsume is the family name, and he somehow became known in that order. And he somehow became known as Natsume Soseki and not Soseki Natsume. I don't know why that is, probably a coincidence. And in Germany, there is a lot of inconsistency in how he is called, which of his names is given first. And in libraries, he's always under N consistently. I think in English libraries too. But anyway, this book follows the first-person narration of a young man. He is just about to enter university when the book starts and has just graduated when it ends. And in the summer before he enters university, he is on a beach holiday, and he somehow latches onto an older man and kind of adopts him as he calls him sensei, but he is not a teacher in a formal sense, and it remains obscure what exactly the young man hopes to learn from him. He is just somehow intellectually attracted to him and hopes to learn philosophy for life from him. Sensei is an old misanthrope, and he stays away from people for the most part, and there are suggestions of a dark event in his past that has made him lose faith in humanity, and that's why he more or less lives the life of a hermit together with his wife at their house. But the young man is so exuberant and so optimistic that Sensei cannot get rid of him and is unable to keep him at arm's length for very long, and slowly opens up to him. And in time, the young man will come to learn about the nature of that dark event in Sensei's past that shaped his personality. This often gets described as being about the conflict or the contrast of old Japan and its people of the Meiji era, which has just passed, and the more modern, more open Japanese people. But I think it is just a timeless story about the contrast between youthful innocence and optimism and a more jaded old age. And there is another novel by Natsume Soseki that often gets described as his only coming-of-age story, which would be the novel Sanshiro. But I think that this is as much a coming-of-age story because in the course of the novel, we get to witness a rather tragic event that in hindsight will come to take on significance of the event that marked the young man's passing from innocent youth into a state that is more similar to Sensei's. So this might not be the most mind-blowing of novels ever written, but I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it goes right into the fields. And just so you know, there is a new English translation. This is the new translation. The first English translation was made shortly after the book was first published in 1914, I think. And this is a more recent one, which I'm quite sure will be the better one of the two. But just so you are aware that there are two English translations. So that is it finally. Those are all the books that I read in the month of May, all the novels at least. It was a very interesting reading month, and I hope that you found something of interest in this video as well. I'm off now. I'm going out to make the most of the sunny day because who knows how long that will last, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye guys!